on British Muslim TV, coming to you live, of course, on our satellite platforms, as well as throughout BMTV's various social media platforms. Today, we're going to be discussing Islamophobia in Europe, and it's quite a vast topic. We're going to hone in on two countries in Europe, more specifically Sweden and France. And we're going to discuss each of those together as well as separately throughout this conversation. Hopefully, we've just had Emmanuel Macron win his second election there in France. And in this win, this is being hailed as a win against the far right of the country. But is that really true? Over the past 5 years, if we look at Macron's own record, as well as the growing strength now of his opponent, Marine Le Pen, it's a worrying trend, is it not, for French society and the direction that it's been moving in. And on top of that, then, of course, we can add the far-right group of Sweden, the hardline, led by a Swedish politician, Rasmus Paludan, who has planned on and has already burned a Quran. He's planned on a tour, in fact, of Muslim-populated areas of Sweden, and that has resulted in protests and riots as well there. Is this all really just a battle over free speech at this time against a Muslim takeover, as some may say, against Islamism, as others may say? Or is this, in fact, just politically convenient scapegoating of Muslims at a time of economic and other challenges that many of these European countries are facing? So let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're joined by Dr. Masoud Kamali, who is a professor of sociology and social work at Mid-Sweden University. Masoud, thank you very much for taking your time out today for joining us here on The Scope. Masoud, I'd like to ask you firstly about this Quran burning incident. What are your thoughts about it? Why it's happening? It's certainly not the first time, but what does Swedish society say about this, and what does it say about Swedish society as well?
Well, thank you for having me here. Well, the Quran burning is not new in Sweden. It's now the last 24 years. We have seen several times Paludan and others try to do it. Sometimes successful, sometimes not. But this year was very clear that he could do that, and we had a huge riots in several cities in Sweden and burning cars and others. Why it happens right now has to do with the increasing racism and xenophobia and anti-Muslimism in Sweden. Since 2010, we have a racist party in the parliament called Sweden Democrat, or Sverigedemokraterna. They are like Paludan and the same ideology, far-right ideology, and anti-Muslim. The leader of party already in 2011 said that we should not take or allow people from Muslim countries coming to Sweden, and we have to, have at least Christians and other religious groups coming here, but not Muslims, because Muslims plan to take over Europe and so on. So after that, since 2010, we are witnessing the increasing racism, xenophobia, and anti-Muslimism. I think it's nothing about Islamophobia. We should use the word anti-Muslimism, which has its roots really in crusades. And in my research, in European research, I already mentioned or wrote in 2008 that crusades never ended. It just changed the shape and the content maybe, but it never ended. So as soon as something is happening, has to do with Muslims, you saw the war on terror started by George W. Bush, said it's a new crusade and we have to win this crusade. The same discourses is using in Sweden and in other countries in Europe. So I
wonder, Masoud, if I may come in for a moment, because a lot of people, Masoud, would say that that in fact this is Muslims who do not integrate well into the European society. How do you respond to that argument?
Oh, this is I think it's just nonsense. I was put at the head of the governmental inquiry in 2004 by Swedish government as the to do research or to write a report about structural and institutional discrimination and racism in Sweden. Already then, at 2006, we informed the Swedish government that something is happening in the footsteps of the war on terror, and Muslims are really attacked and are really subjected to structural and institutional discrimination. Racism is on rise. And we witnessed that 2010, we had a new party, which is now the third largest party in Sweden, Sweden Democrats, entering the parliament. And integration was much better, I could say, 19th and early 2000 than today, because of the neoliberal policies and neoliberal changes in Sweden, which led to increasing marginalization and racism in Sweden, not only against Muslims, against even other groups. So it's not just Muslims who have problems. Many other immigrant groups from Africa, from Latin America, and so on, have the same problem in Sweden. So really, it's a change in the structure of the Swedish society as being one of the most equal and integrating society. Today is a neoliberal society, which the class gaps are much larger than any other country in Northern even, not only in Europe.
Okay. Let me come in now, because I wanted to, if you allow me, Masoud, introduce our other guest now who is joining us. We're happy to be joined by Dr. Tahir Abbas, who's a professor of radicalization studies at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. He's joining us from The Hague. Tahir, thank you very much for taking your time out to join us today here on British Muslim TV and The Scope. You may have heard Masoud speaking there, Tahir, about integration in these societies in Europe. And of course, we can talk about France as well as Sweden, or just Europe as a whole. What are your thoughts about that? Because that's an argument that keeps coming up, right, whenever we talk about Muslims, that they do not integrate well into European society.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I was just listening to Masoud earlier. I think what he was saying about Sweden could apply to many countries across Europe right now. The changes to the economy in terms of the shifting away from traditional manufacturing industrial sectors to this globalized service economy has meant that Muslims have been left behind. And that's part of the sort of structural dynamics. But in terms of how we think about Islamophobia, it's well documented. I remember going back to 1996 when the Runnymede Trust started with the Commission on Islamophobia, and we documented what we could at the time. This was during the Bosnian War, the Bosnian crisis, as well as ongoing conflicts across the Middle East, Western-led interventions, etc. So Islamophobia is very much real. It's observable. It's measurable. It's almost normal. It's practically normal. Islamophobic headlines in newspapers are every day. So this idea that somehow Muslims are not integrating, it's complete, to use the word earlier, the nonsense, in the sense that integration is a two-way street. No longer this is the case, be like us, but we won't recognize differences. It's back to assimilationist rhetoric that was going on, say, in the UK in the 1950s and 60s. There is really very little acceptance of differences in society, or certainly no protections or support offered in the way that might have been provided in the past. In terms of the racial equality structures of the UK, they've been thoroughly dismantled. They were much stronger in the 70s and 80s and had much more bite and teeth. Nowadays, it's very much off the radar altogether. So everywhere you go across Europe, and I think also North America, although the American Muslims are slightly different, but certainly in Europe, which has a history of migration and working in different and declining economic sectors, the position today is really quite problematic and gets worse day by day, month by month.
Yeah, we've just had, as I said in the introduction, Macron won the election, but then that's been sold to all of us around the world as this huge win against the far right, right? But then that's not the entire nuanced view or context of French society, is it? I mean, because Macron himself has moved ever more right the moment he pretty much came into office, and he realized that he needed to do so for his own political career. At least that's one of the theories on that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everywhere in Europe, again, tilting to the right politically, it's going alongside the sort of the neoliberal economic paradigm. They seem to be aligned very much. And we've also seen the growth of the far right, not just in mainstream politics, i.e. the radical right. And we have people who are espousing very strong anti-immigrant rhetoric, and they get elected and get into positions of power. I mean, Brexit in the UK is all about an anti-immigration hostility, essentially, and local issues as well, which have sort of compounded together. So all of these things are very much aligned, and this is where you get a populism and authoritarianism and the displacement of the real world issues onto immigrants and minorities, which leads to more of the same problems. And then what it does for the minorities, it makes them feel entrenched. It makes them feel even further excluded. And this is where we find people entering into risky areas. and becoming therefore seen as a risk as a result of that.
Yeah. Okay, so Masoud, I wanted to bring you in and then ask you about the more Europe-wide issue of Islamophobia or anti-Muslimism, as you termed it, Masoud. Is this something that you feel that has been spreading, or is this something that is unique to each country? How do you view it as an academic yourself?
Well, I had a research project since 2001 to 2008, funded by European Union. The result is published in a book called Racial Discrimination, Institutional Patterns and Politics. We had 8 countries in Europe, 8 European countries engaged in this project, and showed that racism, I'm talking about 2001 to 2008, and of course, even today, that racism and anti-Muslimism has become the main you can say, face of racism in Europe. And given the history of Europe and the crusade and the history of racism in Europe, we can say that it is increasing, of course. I have been in Sweden for 35 years, and in Europe have been making research. I never experienced such a racism, widespread racism and anti-Muslimism as I do today. We inform Swedish government, we inform European Union each year about the increasing racism and anti-Muslimism. Unfortunately, on the contrary, we have seen that established parties, I just will mention, that's the most important thing is that everybody talks about these right-wing parties, right? Le Pen or Swedish Democrats or British National Party and so on. But really the problem is the mainstream parties. Mainstream parties are adopting the programs of right-wing parties. We have shown in our research, which is published, that the most dangerous thing that is happening is that the mainstream parties, such as even social democratic parties in northern countries and other parties in Europe, are adopting.
Masoud, I'm gonna interrupt you just because we're going into a very quick break. I do apologize for cutting you off there. We're gonna go into a very short break now, viewers, but I'll be back with Tahir and Masoud right after this break, continuing this discussion. Please do stay with us for that. Of course, we're talking about, as I said, Sweden, France, as well as Europe-wide issues with Muslims at this time. Stay with us for that. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, here on BMTV. We're continuing to discuss Islamophobia in Europe. Tahir, I wanted to bring you into the discussion once again, and I want to ask you about the right-wing groups and the rise of the right-wing across the continent. Is this because more so of economic issues, or is this genuine just to do with ideology? Is that what's at the root of this?
It's multi-layered. Of course, the economic issues are important to think about in terms of widening social divisions, economic inequalities, the people who feel left behind. So that anger is turned ultimately into violence in some cases. But that would be too simplistic. We have to understand the underlying tendency also around the ease with which it is possible for people to take up these anti-Muslim perspectives and again turn them all the way to violence. I'm not talking about lone actors. There's nothing lone about lone actors. They're very much part of online communities and they organize themselves, share ideas. But we've seen many cases now all across Europe in the last few years, also Australia, New Zealand, sorry, Australian chap in New Zealand. And these people are talking about the great replacement. They're talking about the kebab removalist. These kinds of very racist, sort of ethnic cleansing-oriented type of ideas emerging from the Bosnian War are being played out today, and then with the use of technology, played live, streamed across social media platforms. It's become too easy, and there's no real attempt to understand it. And in terms of the far right and the radical right, when it comes to extremism, only now has it come under the attention of security, policing, intelligence services in any serious or meaningful way. And the scale of the problem is far greater than any Islamist or sort of jihadi type problem that has ever really occurred in Europe over the last 20 to 30 years. So it's very imbalanced. And if anything, the far right discussion in relation to extremism is helping us to think about society, mental health, the role of social media. But when it came to the Muslims and the Islamists, it was ideology. We need to do something about the ideology. We need to do something about moderating these Muslims. So I think there's something that's helpful for Muslims out of this, a very small window of opportunity. But so many parameters are aligned. The right, politically, economically, ideologically, it's all being revealed before us.
Yeah, Masoud, I'm glad, Tahir brought that up, because I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that as well. What does this do to society as well, right? Where we have heard, for example, and I keep bringing France in because it seems that has been under discussion a lot when it comes to France's relations with its Muslim citizens. But for example, there is talk, or in certain media outlets, about French Muslims moving out of France in significant enough numbers that it would have some effect on the country. I mean, that would change society, would it not? I mean, that should be a worrying trend for that sort of a country, shouldn't it?
Well, yes, but I mean, yes and no. You see, these discussions, we had these discussions for many, many years. What we are seeing about in France, which was a part of my project about Islamophobia and racism in Europe, and also Sweden that we see today. I mean, Muslims coming here from many different countries, many different cultures, and living here and have left here for many, many years. During the last decades, I could say, 2 decades, the Muslim problem, or the problem has been connected, the problem of migration have been connected to Muslims and Muslim group. I would say that the most important change that I have seen is the change in ideology of ruling parties in Sweden and in other countries, which, I mean, little by little, they changed their ideologies and adapted themselves to the racist parties. Of course, Muslims in those countries, I know that in Sweden and many other countries in Europe, that people living in those countries now are experiencing a very hard time. Many decide, they have contacted me, contacted many other of my friends, civil society agents, are saying that we have to have a B plan, which is leaving these countries because they don't want to have us, and they start to attack. And something that I have to mention here is what's happening in the normal political system in countries like Sweden. We did a research and showed that many Muslims are forcing to leaving the parties, the normal parties in Sweden, Social Democrats, moderates, and other parties, which has been ruling parties in Sweden. They do not accept Muslims. If you are going to be a part of those parties and do political career, you have to leave your religion, you have to leave your culture, you have to be really like us and then integrated. So it's something which is very, very dangerous, which is happening now in Sweden and in also, of course, other countries.
That's a good point, Tahir, and I want to bring that up with you as well about political influence and just the political role that Muslims play in Europe, right? So an argument could be made, I would think, from possibly the Muslim side that we're, as Muslims, not strong enough politically across the continent. Is that a fair statement to make? And why do you think that is? Is it because we're not united enough, that we haven't figured out how to make our voice heard properly?
Well, a lot of it is again, historical. I mean, the Muslims are a big community. We have a singular concept that brings us together. But as we know, very divided ethnically, tribally, culturally, from a sectarian perspective and so on, which means that it's easy to break us up and even get us to fight against each other, and which is what's going on in many parts of the world, certainly in the Middle East. And yes, you're right, the political base is weak. I mean, I think the political base is weak partly because the main political parties have exploited it. I know in the UK context, we have sort of the block mobilization of local votes through local community leaders, which the political parties fully exploited to their ends, not for the community's needs or wants. That still goes on. And it's really, if you want to get ahead in politics, you have to assimilate, you have to be seen to be beyond any shadow of doubt in terms of your values and norms. But even then, when there's criticism, there's likely to be greater criticisms for people who are still visible, irrespective of their ostensible values as such. I mean, it's complicated. I think there are lots of factors. I mean, can we blame the Muslim communities for some of the problems that they're experiencing? I think all communities are going to have some problems. And we do, when I say we in the broader collective sense, and many things do get in the way: ethnicity, class, location, etc. And these are issues we have to be very careful and very sensitive about. And I think this is where the next generations are much more flexible, much more open about this topic than, say, 30, 40 years ago, when it was very much localized and tribalistic.
Okay, Masoud, as a community that would be targeted, any community, right, that would feel out of place in any respective society, I would think that there are some very real security concerns there too, because if you have your own citizens or a significant number of your citizens who do not feel like they're respected and or part of society, then that can possibly be dangerous for that society. Am I right to say that, Masoud?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have already, in this governmental inquiry we had in Sweden, 2006, said that, when we asked people at that time, young people in marginalized areas, we realized that it's something happening, which is the poverty is ethnicized and the poverty is Muslimized. I mean, many Muslims are marginalized now, young people that do not feel any belonging to the society they are living. The labor market, neoliberal changes of the Swedish society, for instance, in which schools privatized, people are not getting jobs, they are not going, people, when I'm talking about is young Muslim people, marginalized in marginalized areas. Many of, why they come here from Denmark and burn Quran in marginalized areas, but not in center of the city, because to evoke some kind of reactions, which is a stereotype of Muslims. They are not reasonable. They just see the Quran as something they have to make a riot against, protest, killing, burning cars and so on. It's really a very conscious action that they take, because we have the poverty, we have marginalization, we have many Muslim groups marginalized really in Nordic countries and in European countries. We are talking about ethno-class, which is becoming a Muslim group. And then Marine Le Pen in France or Sociology in Sweden, they are built up on this. And that's what, it's dangerous. It's dangerous not only for those people with Muslim background, but also for a society in which about 10% of the population are Muslims.
Yeah, and Tahir, I know that this is one of your specialties, of course, radicalization studies as a whole. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? Because again, it just seems logical that if you have, for example, French Muslims in banlieues, for example, who feel like they are in some way suppressed, that they will be some reaction at some point, right? And some of that may very well create some insecurity in society.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've been saying this for 20 plus years. It's exactly the problem. It's exactly why we have extremism. People feel that they're not valued, they don't have a place, they don't have a future, their religion is demonized, their community is attacked, and there's no recourse to the state. So these other kinds of meanings that people can bring into their lives is a route forward. And so absolutely. And so the hostile nature of the state is acting in preparation of further radicalization. It's not helping the matter. So Islamophobia creates radicalization, which creates Islamophobia, and it ends up in a vicious circle.
Yeah. And so, Masoud, what's the way to then deal with this? How should politicians go about doing this? I mean, how does one then, what is a logical policy then in this case?
So, of course, we had in Sweden something which says that you have to include the protests. You have to include them in the real politics. You have to allow people to participate in the democratic games. I mean, when you are excluding people from the democracy, from democratic games. So what they do, radicalization is, I mean, we have had that not just among Muslims, among young people joining radical leftist groups and so on during 70s, 60s. It's the same politics. We have had the answer. The answer was a very well-developed welfare state, inclusion, solidarity, and so on. But all those have been destroyed by neoliberalization of societies, even in the most integrated societies like Nordic societies. So I think the way forward is really back to the roots of the welfare state, inclusion and democracy.
Very well. We're going to have to leave that as a final word, unfortunately, but we really, really appreciate both Dr. Masoud Kamali and Dr. Tahir Abbas for taking their time out for their, no doubt, busy schedules to join us today here on this Tuesday on BMTV. We were discussing, of course, Islamophobia in Europe. We looked at the case studies of Sweden and France, but of course, we spoke in more general terms as well about European society's issues with their respective Muslim citizens. And again, not from a victimhood point of view, but just from an integration and other points of view that really exist in those countries. Of course, next week, do join us again, or actually 2 weeks from now, as we'll have a live show again on international affairs. Thank you for watching.